The Seahawks are done with splashy signings in free agency, but that doesn't mean they're not done filling out their roster. I'm going to dive into 3 new additions made this week, added to the roster here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A special thanks to all the 12s out there, whether you're tuning in from Bellevue, Washington, or Butte, Montana. Thank you to each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. We are drawing closer and closer to the NFL draft. And interestingly, this is the 50th year anniversary of the Seattle Seahawks. And so in this little break between free agency and the draft, the team unleashed their 50th anniversary patch. They will be wearing their uniforms. And to commemorate that 50th anniversary, I'm going to be diving into my top 50 player all-time roster. We'll be doing that on today's show. Jam-packed episode brought your way by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Now for your lead story here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Much to the chagrin of Seahawk fans, there hasn't been a signing of another veteran guard the last week and a half, and really free agency isn't even a crawl at this point. Teams are, for the most part, done signing players. That doesn't mean there haven't been any moves, but these splashy signings, those were done a week and a half ago. Teams have really shifted their focus back towards the draft, and any moves that are made now, for the most part, are depth signings, and those are still important. These are still guys that have a chance to contribute, particularly on special teams. And this week, the Seahawks have actually signed 3 players, and there's a little bit of a theme going on here in terms of homecomings in the receiving corps. We already saw Cooper Kupp come back, formerly starring at Eastern Washington. Another former Washington college program standout at the receiver position is also making his way back to the Pacific Northwest. That's River Craycraft, formerly starring for the Washington State Cougars. And Craycraft had a fantastic college career. The fact that he's still hanging around in the NFL, it speaks to his perseverance, because he's only had 32 catches for 374 yards and 3 touchdowns in his career. He's now 30 years old. He has bounced all over the league. He's been on a bunch of practice squads. He's gotten some opportunities. Last year, Miami played him in a handful of games, and he just continues to find ways to get into regular season games, even if the numbers aren't necessarily there. And Craycraft, when he was at Washington State, he was as crafty of a slot receiver as you were going to find at the college level. That is not translated to production in the NFL because he doesn't have the athletic profile that a lot of the really good slot receivers have in the NFL, but he has still been productive when he's had his opportunities. So this is another chance for him to compete potentially for a roster spot. He's played in some special teams. You have to last this long as a reserve receiver in the league. So just another guy to add to this competition for a rebuilt receiving corps. And certainly fans will be rooting for him to have success in the preseason and training camp to try to fight for one of those final roster spots, given his popularity. He was one of the most popular players that's been at Washington State in the last 20 years. And Cougar fans continue to follow him very closely at this stage of his career when he hasn't had a lot of opportunities, but he's done something when he has gotten his chances to play. As for the tight end position, if anybody was expecting that Seattle was going to go out and sign a splashy player at that spot when they still had Noah Fant on the roster, probably shouldn't have been expecting that. But what they did need to do, they needed to find somebody to fill Pharaoh Brown's role, a role that unfortunately Brown did not fill the way the Seahawks hoped last year, as that reserve tight end that can be an inline blocker, can help the run game, and can contribute on special teams. And Eric Saubert can do that for the Seahawks. Now, this is another player. He has been with 7 teams in 8 years. He's bounced around. He's got 47 career catches in 8 seasons. Ironically, his best season as a pass catcher came in 2022 with the Broncos when he had 15 catches, and Klint Kubiak coordinated a few of those games and was the quarterback coach on that staff. So there is a tie there to this coaching staff for the Seattle Seahawks. And I believe Justin Outen was also on that staff, and I think he was coaching tight ends in Denver. So this is a guy that has a relationship with a few of the new coaches in Seattle. Last year did catch a touchdown for the 49ers, so he's had a few touchdowns in his career. But what he's going to give the Seahawks is a 3 or 4 tight end. He's a guy that isn't guaranteed a roster spot, but if you can come in and play special teams, he had over 300 special teams snaps last year for San Francisco. He's played a ton of special teams, and that's one of the reasons he's hung around this long in the NFL. If he can provide that value and can give them a punch as a blocker that can come into games in 12 and 13 personnel packages with multiple tight ends on the field, then he has a chance to carve out a role here in this roster. And maybe Brady Russell stays on as a special teams guy, but Sauber has a lot more experience on offense than what Brady Russell brings to the table. So a lot of people have pointed to this signing like, who? This isn't a big deal. These are the type of guys, though, that you need in reserve roles that you're going to be able to sign to veteran minimum deals that can help you on special teams. They can come in situations where you need blocker, in this case, and Sauber. You have that guy now on your roster that can do that, at least have an opportunity to make this football team. And these are players, we saw it last year with Ankrum, the guard. He signed in Seattle, and then like a month later, he was cut. Sometimes these guys don't last very long, but this is a player that has played pretty well as a blocker in the NFL, and he gives you special teams value. As far as the new additions that interest me the most, in terms of the guy that I think has the chance to make the best impact for the Seattle Seahawks on the field this year, it isn't Craycraft, it isn't Sauber, it's Steven Sims Jr., and this is another guy that's got ties to Klint Kubiak, and it's a long-dated one. Steven Sims Jr. was a freshman at Kansas the one season that Klint Kubiak was there as a receivers coach. So these guys have known each other since 2015. There is a long-standing connection there, and he's got better stats than River Craycraft. Most of these numbers came early in his career in Washington, but 78 catches, over 700 receiving yards. He's got 7 total touchdowns as a receiver and a kick returner. And this is where the value comes in. Now, he's had some issues muffing kicks and punts. I think that's been the biggest reason that he hasn't been able to stick with the team the last few years. He was with Houston as well as Baltimore last year. The season prior, though, in the playoffs, he returned a punt for a touchdown and a loss for the Texans in the divisional round to the Ravens. He had a punt return for a touchdown earlier in his career, and you look at his testing numbers coming out of Kansas, they were pretty pedestrian. But when you watch him on the field, he looks much more athletic, much quicker, and he's really good at reading blocks and being able to create something out of nothing on special teams. And this was a huge issue for the Seahawks last year. They rotated through multiple kick returners. They rotated through multiple punt returners. D. Williams didn't work out. Chenault did not work out. Steven Sims Jr. is a guy that could come in and make it worth keeping him on the roster because he at least has had some production as a receiver in the NFL. He's done a lot of damage out of the slot. So you have that to lean on, but he can return kicks. He can return punts, and he's been effective at that throughout his entire career. Still not quite 30 years old. So this is a guy that I could see potentially making the Seahawks roster just because kick and punt return was such a big problem for them that last season. And this is a guy that has a couple career punt returns for touchdowns. He's been an effective kick returner north of 25 yards per return. So that would be an upgrade for the Seahawks. And the fact that Klint Kubiak knows him well, has known him for a long time, I think that bodes well for them to find a way maybe to sprinkle him into the offense if they need to. At least another guy you can add to the competition there that absolutely comes in as the front runner to be your kick returner and punt returner for the Seahawks next season. Coming up next, going to shift the focus somewhat to the present, but also the past. I'm going to be dishing out my 50-man roster to celebrate 50 years of Seattle Seahawks football. They unleashed their 50th year patch this week. So in commemoration of that, going to be diving into my offensive players first. That'll be coming up next here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by Game Time. Imagine watching your favorite team live, feeling the energy of the crowd and witnessing unforgettable moments. There's nothing like experiencing a big game in person, and getting tickets shouldn't be stressful. That's where Game Time comes in, making it easier than ever to grab last-minute seats at unbeatable prices. Curation makes it easier to find better value for tickets to sports, concert, comedy, and theater. I just checked the Game Time app, and there's some amazing deals out there for Elite Eight matchups coming up in the college basketball tournament. With their lowest price guarantee, if you find a better deal elsewhere, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. They also offer you seat views before you buy, So no surprise fees. You know where you're going to be sitting. It's an opportunity to book with total confidence. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Welcome back to the Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12s who are listening in. And thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. And for your second listen, make sure to check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that the season is over and the draft is getting closer, get the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every day. Find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Earlier this week, the Seahawks revealed the 50th anniversary patch that they are going to be wearing on their uniforms. And look, I know it's just a patch, but I think it was extremely well done. They mixed in the old royal blue colors with the current college navy colors. You got to see the established in 1976. At the top of it, you had the current Seahawks logo. It was really well done. They're going to be wearing that on all their uniforms this year, with it being the 50th season that they have played in the NFL, obviously 1976 being the first year. With that, I'm going to be dishing out, it's very timely here, with that 50th anniversary patch coming out, I'm going to dish out my top 50 Seahawks. And instead of just going 50 down to 1, let's build a roster with the top 50 players. So there might be a few guys that you could make an argument that were in the top 50, but they were the 5th or 6th best player at their position. So sorry, you're not going to make this football team. We are building an actual roster here. So without further ado, let's get to it. I'm going to start this conversation off on the offensive side of the football with the quarterback and running back positions. At QB, this was something that I debated because, look, most teams only carry 2 quarterbacks on their roster, and we only have 50 instead of 53. Look, there's 6 guys that don't play every week, so it doesn't matter at the end of the day. But I think the Seahawks, when you're looking at getting the best 50-man roster, I like having the idea, especially with today's rules, that Dave Craig is my emergency quarterback. And so Russell Wilson, say what you want about how the last few years have transpired in Denver, Pittsburgh, now going to New York. But he was a 10-time Pro Bowler, made an all-pro team, led the team to a Super Bowl victory, nearly won a second one. He is hands down the best quarterback in Seahawks history. And Matt Hasselbeck also led this team to a Super Bowl, made 3 Pro Bowls in a row, was a really good quarterback during his time in Seattle. I think at that point you could argue the best quarterback in Seahawks history until Russell Wilson came along. And Dave Craig led some really good Seahawks teams that pulled some big upsets, had a ton of touchdown passes, made a few Pro Bowl teams himself. All 3 of these players definitely deserved this honor. And look, again, with the rules, if we didn't have the emergency quarterback, I might not keep Dave Craig on this, but he is definitely in discussion for one of the top 50 Seahawks. I'm keeping that extra quarterback. And at running back, I think running back is the deepest position the Seahawks have on offense in their history. Just look at the talent here. There's no way you can keep these 4 guys off the roster, and this is a position with a lot of attrition. But Marshawn Lynch and Sean Alexander, can you imagine that 1-2 punch? And oh, by the way, third downs, we can bring Kurt Warner or Chris Warren. And probably Chris Warren, who was the best receiver of these 4 players. But you've got the smash mouth football with Marshawn Lynch, the glider that is Sean Alexander. Kurt Warner could do a little bit of everything. And Chris Warren was a big guy that could run over and around people. To me, this is the deepest position group the Seahawks have, at least in the offensive side of the football in their team history, because Chris Carson, without the career-ending injury, you could make arguments for Chris Carson if he would have had a little longer career. They've had a ton of good running backs. Ricky Waters was great during his time in Seattle at the end of his career. But you can only keep 4 here. I can't have 15 running backs. It's a very deep position group for the Seahawks, though, that definitely warrants 4 players making this football team. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we've got to have a fullback, because the Seahawks, if you look at their history, the fullback has been a big part of the Seahawks history until recently. And I was excited that Klint Kubiak was going to be bringing it back this year. But Max Strong, to me, is one of the best fullbacks that's played in the last 25, 30 years in the NFL. He could get you yardage as a runner. He was a Mack truck as a blocker. He blocked for 1,000-yard seasons for Chris Warren, Ricky Waters and Sean Alexander. And he was a key part of that. He could catch the football out of the backfield, and he had a really long career. So got to have him at the fullback spot. As for wide receiver, this one I actually had some debate at the bottom of the depth chart because Steve Largent, Doug Baldwin, and Tyler Lockett, those guys are consistently in the top 3 in Seahawks history in receptions, receiving yards, touchdowns. To me, that was a slam dunk. But the fourth receiver was actually pretty challenging because Joey Galloway early in his career before going to Dallas, Galloway had 4 really good years. Brian Blades was an excellent player despite the fact that he didn't have the quarterbacks around him. DK Metcalf now going to Pittsburgh. I mean, his first 6 years were historically good. But I got to go with Bobby Ingram here because I think Bobby Ingram is the most underrated receiver in Seahawks history. And how many times did Matt Hasselbeck turn to him in critical situations? He was a very good football player. And I think some of his best seasons, maybe all of his best seasons, were in Seattle in that West Coast offense for Mike Holmgren. So ultimately, a guy that helped get Seattle to a Super Bowl, was one of their most productive receivers, had a couple 1,000-yard seasons. To me, Bobby Ingram is the one that deserves to be on here, but it was close with Brian Blades and a few of those other guys. Brian Blades obviously had a much more yardage in his career, but to me, Bobby Ingram was one of those guys that his impact outweighed his stats, and he was incredibly important. And I think if you're looking at this from a roster standpoint, that his skill set is going to be really good to go with some of the other explosive guys that Seattle's got on that receiving core. Going to the tight end position, as well as the tackles. At tight end, to me, tight end is maybe the weakest position in Seahawks history. Zach Miller gets the nod here because he was the best blocking tight end on those Super Bowl teams. He had a few years with decent pass catching production. And Jimmy Graham, look, for all the complaints fans have, and I get it, I understand the trade for Max Unger, that hurt Seattle more than it helped them, getting rid of their all-pro center. And Graham didn't necessarily fit what they were trying to do with him, but he still had multiple Pro Bowl seasons. He still had a year with 10 touchdowns. He had really good numbers catching the football for Seattle, despite the situation. To me, it's to me a slam dunk. Those two contrasting styles, he could really make that work on this roster. And I'm keeping only 3 tackles on this football team, because to me, there's 3 guys, and then there's a significant drop-off to the rest of the tackles the Seahawks have had. Walter Jones, top 3 tackle in NFL history, only had, I believe, 9 holding penalties his entire career. The guy was absolutely incredible. Dwayne Brown made a couple of all-pro teams in his brief time in Seattle. To me, he's the second best tackle that the Seahawks have had. And Russell Okung, he only made 1 Pro Bowl, but he started for the team for 6 years. He started a couple of Super Bowls. Injuries prevented him from reaching his potential, but he still had 6 really solid seasons in Seattle. Maybe could have been a Pro Bowl or one of those other years, if not for injuries. To me, that's the drop-off you're dealing with here, though. Tackle has not necessarily been a strong position for the Seahawks over the years. Aside from Walter Jones, I think Dwayne Brown gave him some really good seasons, and Russell Okung would be number 3 on my list. Going to the interior, this is where the talent really is, depth-wise, for the Seattle Seahawks on this offensive line. Max Unger, Robbie Tobeck, the 2 best centers in franchise history. You know, Blair Bush had some good years in Seattle. We can give him a nod, but not quite good enough to make the cut here. And at the guard position, Steve Hutchinson, Hall of Famer, multi-time All-Pro. Obviously, the poison pill incident created a rift with him and Seahawks fans. Now that he's back with the organization, that's been cleaned up some. He's been inducted into the Ring of Honor as well. Hutch is one of the best guards ever to play the game. And Kevin Mawai, he played guard for a good chunk of his 4 years that he was with the Seahawks before moving to center, before he became a Hall of Fame center elsewhere. And he had 4 really good seasons just on teams that were underwhelming. So people didn't notice him, goes to New York and Tennessee, has a fantastic career. And Chris Gray was a Super Bowl guard for the Seahawks as well. So you can make an argument that really a lot of the really good linemen, it was from the team that made the Super Bowl in 2005. That team had 4 players that are on this team. So absolutely loaded offensive line, easily the best the Seahawks have had. And real quick, because to me, kickers are obviously offensive. Punters come on at the end of offense, and then kick and punt returners set up the offense. So to me, specialists need to be in this section of the show. And this isn't cheating. Tyler Lockett is on the roster in part because he's a kick returner. But Tyler Lockett, I thought about Joey Galloway here as well, but I kept this spot for one of the receivers. Leon Washington is the extra that comes on because Leon, to me, is the best kick returner the Seahawks have ever had. The 3 years that he was returning kicks and punts, he absolutely won some games for the Seahawks with his magician-like abilities back there, returning kicks and punts. And then at the kicker and punter positions, going to go with two guys that were on the Super Bowl winning team. Steven Hauschka was money in the bank 95% of the time. This guy was as consistent of a kicker as the Seahawks have had, made huge kicks in both the seasons they got to the Super Bowl. And John Ryan, how could you not have John Ryan on here? He made a Pro Bowl or two as a punter. We know the notable touchdown pass to Gary Gilliam in the NFC title game against Green Bay that fueled that exciting comeback, the rare comeback in the fourth quarter and in overtime. And, of course, the faces he made there. John Ryan, one of the most popular players in Seahawks history. So that rounds out my special teams. We would get one of those linemen that would be a backup that can long snap. We don't need to have a 50th anniversary long snapper hired. No offense to Clint Gresham and company, but we're going to have, maybe Kevin Mawai handle those duties, or somebody that's a backup on the offensive line can handle the long snapping. When we come back, I've still got an entire defense to roll through on my 50th anniversary top 50 player roster. We'll continue that coming up next here on our Thursday edition of Locked On Seahawks. Welcome back to Locked On Seahawks Thursday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. A special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in. And thank you, as always, to each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. This week, the Seahawks dishing out their 50th anniversary patch that they will be wearing on their uniforms. And in honor of that, going to go with the perfect timing here, dishing out my top 50-man roster for season number 50. We just looked at offense and special teams. Defense has got a couple more players than the offensive side of the football because offensive line had 4 backups. Defense feels like you can rotate more guys. And honestly, I feel like the Seahawks have a few more defensive players that are worthy of top 50 recognition than what they do on the offensive side of the football. Starting in the trenches, I'm keeping 6 defensive ends. And this is my rationale behind this. There are a few guys on this list that were big bodies that could play inside as well as outside. There's a lot of positional versatility, and all 6 of these guys were too good to keep off this roster. To me, it's one of the deep position groups in Seahawks history in terms of all-around play. When you're looking at defensive ends, Jacob Green is the class of this group. Jacob Green was 3rd in NFL history when he retired in sacks unofficially. He's now much lower on the list, but still, I think he is still the biggest snub in Seahawks history for the Hall of Fame. Sean Alexander would be second behind him on that list. But to me, Jacob Green is number 1. The numbers he put up, the number of all pros and Pro Bowl teams he was on, this guy was one of the best defensive ends in this era, and I feel like he got the shaft a little bit. He deserved to be in the Hall of Fame. And then behind him, Michael Bennett, Cliff Averill from those Legion of Boom squads. The Seahawks don't win a Super Bowl without those two coming over in free agency. Michael Bennett's positional versatility, his ability to slither into the backfield and make plays for a tackle for loss. He had a couple years where he had big sack numbers. He just was really difficult to block. And Cliff Averill, he was that true outside speed rusher that could wreak havoc with his burst off the line of scrimmage, his ability to dip around the corner. Underrated run defender. Both these guys were team leaders as well on the field. And rounding out this group, Michael Sinclair, it might have been a brief spell of elite play, but he was so dominant in the mid-1990s, one of the Seahawks' all-time sack leaders. He's got to be on this team. Jeff Bryant's sack numbers dipped later in his career. Early in his career, he had quite a few of them, but he was such a good run defender, and he was a really good 3-4 defensive end, a bigger guy. And then Chris Clemens, a valuable player on those teams that got to the playoffs early in Pete Carroll's tenure, had almost 40 sacks in 4 years with the team. He was a dynamic pass rusher that caused a lot of problems. That was one of the shrewdest trades the Seahawks have ever made, and it really was one of the good ones John Schneider has had during his tenure, and it was right off the bat, bringing Chris Clemens in, an established veteran that had maybe the best seasons of his career in Seattle, 3 straight years with double-digit sacks for the Seahawks. Now shifting to the interior. Defensive tackles, because I've got Jeff Bryant And I've got Jacob Green, Michael Bennett. I've got a number of guys that can rush from the interior. To me, there are three guys that absolutely belong on this roster. Cortez Kennedy, top 3, top 4 player in franchise history. 1992 Defensive Player of the Year, took over games. Joe Nash, only 1 Pro Bowl, but the guy was in Seattle for 16 seasons, incredibly productive. I still think he belongs in the Ring of Honor. The fact he isn't in there, it's disappointing. I'd like to see him get his due. He was a fantastic player for a long time. And Brandon Mebane, the king of the belly roll himself, he was an integral part of those Seahawks defenses that got to the Super Bowl. Might not have had the gaudy sack numbers, but he was stout against the run, very difficult to move off the line of scrimmage, beloved in the locker room. And he was one of the few holdovers the Seahawks held on to when Pete Carroll and John Schneider took over. He's with the team for many years in the Carroll Schneider era. And so this guy deserves to be on this football team, a really well-rounded, no pun intended, well-rounded player for the Seahawks defensive line. As for the linebackers, obviously number 54 has got to be the top of this list. Bobby Wagner, the tackle king in franchise history, perennial all-pro selection, future first ballot Hall of Famer in Canton with his efforts in Seattle. And then Lofa Tatupu might have had a much shorter career, but he was outstanding early in his career. He was a Pro Bowler as a rookie for that defense that helped the Seahawks get to their first Super Bowl in franchise history. Has an All-Pro to his name, multiple Pro Bowls, racked up a bunch of tackles, had underrated coverage ability, intercepted quite a few passes. He belongs in this list. And Keith Butler, for a long time, was the Seahawks' unofficial tackle leader until he was passed by Eugene Robinson and eventually Bobby Wagner. Butler with over 800 career tackles, a very underrated standout player in the middle of the Seahawks defense throughout the 80s, late 70s into the 80s, and then ended up becoming a really good NFL defensive coordinator as well. But he's a fantastic football player that gives great depth at that middle linebacker spot. Let's shift gears now to the outside. And these are your true off-ball linebackers that also can blitz. KJ Wright, obviously, with the 10 years in Seattle, he was a key component of those Legion of Boom defenses. Really deserved to be on more All-Pro and Pro Bowl consideration for teams, but he was on a star-studded defense, kind of got overshadowed, but he had really good numbers, one of the top tacklers in franchise history. And Chad Brown had an All-Pro, a couple Pro Bowls in Seattle. His best years were in Pittsburgh, but he was still a menace off the edge for the Seahawks in the late 90s. He deserves his due as one of the most disruptive outside linebackers that they've had. And for the cornerback spot, the starters are easy here. Richard Sherman, obviously the tip, all the All-Pros, the Pro Bowls, leading the league in interceptions a couple times. He was as dominant of a corner as there was in the 2010s. I think he's a future Hall of Famer. Even if he played the end of his career in San Francisco, look, his best years were in Seattle. He had some fantastic seasons, helped his team get to a couple Super Bowls, both on the field and off the field. The way he carried himself really carried this football team. And Richard Sherman is number one. Dave Brown, among the league, one of the leaders in interceptions for the Seahawks. The guy was fantastic. And the fact that he didn't get in the Hall of Fame, that's another guy you could look at. Did not have the Pro Bowl and All-Pro recognition, but he was a phenomenal player, had a ton of interceptions, and he was, in my opinion, the number 2 corner. Even if he had more picks than Richard Sherman, I think Richard Sherman in his prime was the most dominant corner. But these two guys on the outside, you can't go wrong with that. And filling out the cornerback depth, Marcus Trufant was one of those guys that could play slot. He could play in the boundary. I think he'd play in the slot quite a bit in his prime with this group of corners. Sean Springs, that's a fantastic reserve that you can rotate in that also, if you had to, could return kicks and punts. And Keith Simpson is number 5 on my list. One of the most underrated corners in Seahawks history, played a long time in Seattle, was a high draft pick that lived up to that billing. Another guy that got overshadowed, though, with all the talent that the Seahawks had in the secondary during the late 70s into the early and mid 80s, just kind of overshadowed there, but had really good production, good interception numbers. He belongs on this team as the last corner and a guy that could play a little bit inside and out. And rounding thing is out. This, to me, is the deepest position group in Seahawks history. It's not running back. It's not defensive end. It's safety. You got to think about some of the guys, and I'll mention it, some of the players that didn't make this team. That tells you the depth here. Earl Thomas and Kenny Easley are the starters. Easley's a Hall of Famer. Absolutely rocked people. Incredible ball production, a bunch of defensive touchdowns. Earl Thomas was as good of a free safety as there's been in the last 30 years in the NFL. Absolute ball hawk, smacked people. It stinks that his tenure in Seattle ended the way that it did, but he will eventually be in the Ring of Honor. He was just such a dominant player, so much fun to watch. And then Cam Chancellor, if you want to play 3 safety stats, just make him your extra linebacker and let him go up and blow up tackles like he did multiple times in the league, knocking them on their duff and smacking people over the middle. The enforcer. You got 2 of them really in Kenny Easley and Cam Chancellor. And behind those guys, John Harris, all he did is rank in the top 4 in interceptions in franchise history, but he didn't get a lot of accolades because, again, this was Kenny Easley's secondary, but John Harris had a 10 interception season. This guy was a ball hawk. He could tackle. He is one of the most underrated players ever to put on a Seahawks uniform. And rounding out the safeties, Eugene Robinson, all he did was lead the team in tackles in their history before Bobby Wagner came in. He had a ton of interceptions, extremely productive player, a couple of all-pro teams in Seattle's secondary, on some bad football teams for that matter, but he was able to stand out like Cortez Kennedy did. To me, one of the real gems in Seattle history in terms of production. He's as good as any player that they've had. I want you to just think about a couple of guys I didn't include here, though, at the safety group. Quandre Diggs, the most recent player here, 3 straight Pro Bowls, had almost 20 interceptions in a shorter time window than some of these guys. You could have considered Quandre Diggs for this, but this is such a loaded safety position that you don't have him on there. Reggie Tongue had some really good years in Seattle. He's not going to be in consideration here. This group was absolutely loaded, though, for the Seahawks. And so those 5, those are the ones I can keep. You can make an argument for a 6th one if you're playing a lot of DBs, but to me, the deepest position group in Seahawks history. As always, you can follow me on X and Blue Sky at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. When we come back tomorrow, we're going to be talking about some of our early draft crushes here on Blue Friday, less than a month in. Who are the players that now really have emerged as our crushes? Nick Lee and I are going to be diving into that coming up next. Make sure that you listen to Blue Friday show, and thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. As always, go Hawks.